The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing the moment the judge's eyes met mine. His gavel hovered mid-air, his expression frozen as though time itself had cracked open. He whispered something under his breath, almost as if he were speaking to the past and not the present. I knew instantly that recognition had struck him, even if no one else in the room could understand it. For a brief second, the world held its silence, lawyers shifting in their seats, clerks staring wide-eyed, my own daughter stiffening beside her husband with visible unease. And me? I simply sat there, steady but trembling inside, realizing that fate had circled back in the most unexpected way. I had walked into that courthouse thinking I was just another weary old woman defending a house. To my daughter, Emily, that's all I was, someone clinging to walls and memories. To her husband, Brian, I was nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and a piece of property. But to the judge, in that single flash of recognition, I became something else entirely. It's strange how life leads us into moments we never expect. For years, my mornings were quiet rituals, putting the kettle on at 06, pouring coffee into the chipped mug that had seen more than 20 winters, tending to the violets my late husband had adored. My life was simple, perhaps even invisible to the world, but it was built on sacrifices that only a mother's heart could understand. I scrubbed office floors late at night, stitched hems for neighbors, baked pies for church fundraisers, all so Emily could have the opportunities I never did. I thought love and sacrifice would be enough to bind us forever, but children grow, and sometimes they grow away. Emily learned to measure life not by love, but by convenience and appearances. Brian only sharpened that view, teaching her that property was profit and that sentiment was weakness. Slowly, I began to feel my place shrinking in my own home, as if I were an unwanted guest in the very rooms where I had built my life. Sitting in that courtroom, as the judge's gaze lingered on me, I couldn't help but ask myself, how did we end up here? How did the child I once held in my arms become the one pushing me toward the edge of abandonment? What began as a mother's quiet devotion had somehow turned into a battle over dignity itself. I didn't know it then, but the unraveling had already begun. That first fracture in our bond would reveal itself most clearly one evening at the dinner table, when Emily and Brian decided to show me just how disposable they believed I had become. Most mornings in my house still carried the same rhythm they always had. I would rise at 06:00, fill the kettle, and wait for the familiar hiss of steam before pouring my coffee into the old mug that had followed me through more than 2 decades. It was chipped along the rim, but it was mine. While the coffee cooled, I would water the violets that lined the windowsill. My husband, David, had loved those flowers, and tending to them was my way of keeping him close. Those quiet rituals gave me a sense of belonging. Even without David by my side, the house still breathed with his presence. Every tile in the kitchen had been set by his steady hands. Every creak in the floor carried years of our life together. This place wasn't just walls and wood, it was memory stitched into every corner. And for me, that was enough. I carried this peace into the day I invited Emily and Brian for dinner. I wanted it to be a night of warmth, a reminder that despite the tensions I had felt building, this was still a home filled with love. I cooked David's favorite chicken and dumplings, laid out the embroidered tablecloth I had worked on when Emily was a teenager, and placed fresh flowers at the center. For a moment, as I lit the candles, I believed love could soften the sharp edges I had noticed in my daughter's voice and in Brian's dismissive glances. But as soon as they arrived, the illusion began to crack. Brian dropped into David's old armchair as though it belonged to him, flipping on the television with the ease of ownership. Emily stood stiffly in the kitchen doorway, her expression cool, distant. My heart ached, but I tried to ignore it, hoping the food and the setting would remind her of the home she once cherished. It was during that dinner, spoon poised halfway to my mouth, that Emily made her announcement. She said the house was too much for me, that I couldn't possibly keep up with it anymore, and that it would be better if I moved into a retirement community they had already found. Brian nodded along, smug, as though the decision had already been made. I remember sitting there, my throat tight, trying to remind them that this was not just a house. This was where their father had taken his last breath, holding my hand. This was where every photo on the wall carried our family's story. But Emily brushed it off with words that stung deeper than any wound she told me. Memories lived in the heart, not in the walls. The days that followed only deepened the betrayal. Brian returned with an appraiser who walked through my home as if it already belonged to someone else. Every detail that carried my husband's fingerprints was reduced to numbers on a clipboard. Emily followed him, nodding coldly, never looking back at me. And then came the papers. They sat at my dining table with a lawyer who spread documents across the same cloth I had laid out for our meal just days earlier. When I refused to sign them, when I insisted I wasn't ready to give up my home, their masks slipped. Brian's voice hardened, and Emily's silence cut even deeper. They told me if I didn't cooperate, they might have to question my ability to make decisions at all. They were ready to strip me not just of my home, but of my dignity, by calling me incapable. That night, after they left, I sat in David's chair and felt the weight of years pressing against me. For the first time, I wondered if they were right, if I was too old, too fragile, too useless to stand in their way. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and betrayal, a small voice whispered that this was not the end. I didn't know it yet, but the house still held secrets that would change everything. That night, after Emily and Brian left, the house felt heavier than it ever had before. The silence pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't push away. I sat in David's old armchair, staring at the photos on the wall, and for the first time in my life, I let the thought sink in that maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old to fight, too fragile, too useless. The idea of being forced out of my own home, of being labeled incapable by the very child I had raised with my blood and bones, hollowed me out. I whispered to David in the stillness, asking how I was supposed to stand alone against the two people I had once trusted most. The next afternoon, I moved through the house like a ghost. Every corner felt like it had already been stripped from me. I drifted into David's study, a room I hadn't spent much time in since his passing. His desk was cluttered with the same old envelopes and faded receipts I had seen countless times before. I pulled them out almost absent-mindedly, searching for some piece of him to hold on to, something that would remind me I wasn't as powerless as I felt. That was when my hand brushed against something different, a slim folder tucked at the very back of the drawer, bound with a small lock. My heart skipped. I had never noticed it before. Suddenly, I was no longer just sifting through paper. I was uncovering a secret. I searched the drawers desperately, my hands trembling, until I found a tiny brass key hidden in one of David's old investment books. With shaking fingers, I turned the key and opened the folder. Inside was a stack of documents neatly arranged, each one marked with David's initials. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Contracts, bank statements, property deeds, numbers that didn't seem possible. Then, near the bottom, my eyes landed on something that stopped my breath, a will signed only months before David passed. I sank into his chair as I read, my eyes filling with tears. In the letter attached, written in David's careful hand, he spoke directly to me. He told me he had saved in silence for decades, quietly investing, buying small properties, putting money away. He confessed that he had worried about Brian's ambition long before I had, and he wanted to make sure I would always be protected. He wrote that if Emily showed me love and respect, she would share in what he left behind, but if not, the power would remain with me to use wisely, not to hurt, but to teach. Tears ran freely down my face as I read his words. Grief washed over me all over again, but beneath it was something new: strength. David had trusted me more than I trusted myself, and as I flipped through the rest of the folder, the scope of his foresight became clear. I wasn't just clinging to one house. David had left me an entire portfolio, apartments, land, investments worth more than I could have imagined. And then the twist that made my hands go cold: the building Emily and Brian lived in, the one they thought they were paying rent for each month, was listed under David's name, now mine. Every check they had sent had gone directly into my account without them realizing. For 2 years, I had been their landlord without even knowing it. The despair that had crushed me only a night before began to lift, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't at their mercy. I held far more than they ever imagined. That evening, I brewed my coffee, watered the violets, and placed the folder neatly on the desk. For the first time, I looked around my home, not with fear of losing it, but with certainty that I could defend it. I knew then that the next time Emily and Brian walked through my door, they would not find the fragile mother they thought they could bully. They would face the woman David had trusted to carry his legacy. And I was ready. The morning they returned, I was already waiting. I had brewed my coffee, watered the violets, and placed the folder of documents neatly on David's old desk. When the knock came, I didn't rush. I knew exactly what awaited me on the other side. Through the window, I saw them standing proudly on the porch. Emily kept her eyes down, clutching her coat tightly. Brian, on the other hand, carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the game was already won. Behind them, a pair of movers stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, ready to haul my life out piece by piece. They walked into my living room as if it no longer belonged to me. Brian's tone was sharp, commanding, filled with an arrogance he didn't bother hiding. He gestured to the movers, giving them the kind of look that said he expected immediate obedience. But I didn't move. I stayed seated in my chair, calm, steady, almost invisible to the chaos he tried to create. I told myself to stay quiet, to let him dig his own hole before I lowered the truth onto him. For a moment, I simply observed the way Emily stood at his side, but kept glancing at me with flickers of doubt. The way Brian puffed up his chest as though intimidation were a weapon he could swing at will. Finally, when he demanded the movers start with the living room, I rose. My hands didn't shake. I walked to the desk, picked up one of the deeds, and held it carefully. I asked him if he had ever wondered where the rent checks went each month for the apartment he and Emily had lived in. His smirk faltered, but he tried to brush it off, insisting they had paid faithfully. That was the moment I placed the document in his hand. The silence in the room grew heavy as his eyes scanned the page. Emily leaned closer, confusion knitting her brow. And then I said it the truth that stripped him of his false power. The building was mine. Every rent payment they had made had gone directly to me. For years, without knowing it, he had been writing checks into my account. His face drained of color, the smug confidence collapsing in an instant. Emily's lips parted, stunned, while the movers exchanged uncomfortable glances and shuffled toward the door, sensing they were standing in the middle of a storm about to break. Brian's rage erupted like a fire. He shouted accusations, claiming forgery, manipulation, anything that could explain away the humiliation burning on his face. He threatened lawsuits, tried to claw back control with louder words. But the louder he grew, the calmer I became. Emily stood between us, her voice trembling, torn between loyalty to her husband and the undeniable truth in her mother's hands. Then, in a desperate move, Brian urged her to reveal what she had been hiding. Emily's voice cracked as she admitted she was pregnant. For a moment, my heart twisted news of a grandchild should have been joy. But the way it was thrown into the air, used as a bargaining chip to soften me, cut deeper than any insult. I steadied myself, remembering David's words, use power not to hurt, but to teach. I congratulated her in my heart, but made it clear that motherhood did not erase betrayal. Something shifted in Emily then. For the first time, I saw her eyes linger on Brian with doubt instead of blind loyalty. She seemed to realize he wasn't defending a family, only his pride. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of years of manipulation had suddenly become too heavy to carry. I let the silence hang. I didn't need to raise my voice. The papers, the truth, and the strength David had left me spoke louder than any argument. Brian stormed out with curses on his lips, but Emily lingered, her eyes wet, torn between two worlds, the one she had chosen with him and the one she had nearly abandoned with me. That was the day the balance shifted. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't disposable, and as I closed the folder and set it back on the desk, I knew the storm wasn't over. Brian wasn't the type of man to walk away quietly. A courtroom battle loomed on the horizon, and this time, I would be ready. The morning of the trial carried a weight I could feel in my bones. The courthouse was cloaked in a tense silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and the echo of shoes on the polished floor. As I took my seat beside my attorney, I noticed Brian swaggering in, his chest puffed out as if he had already won. His lawyer mirrored that arrogance, speaking in hushed tones with a confidence that made my stomach twist. I reminded myself to breathe, to hold steady, because I knew what was at stake. My dignity, my home, my truth. When proceedings began, the storm arrived quickly. Brian's lawyer wasted no time painting me as a bitter old woman clinging to the past, manipulating my daughter, and twisting money to destroy a marriage. His words cut deeply, but I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for my turn. Every accusation felt like a dagger, yet I told myself that truth had its own rhythm. It didn't shout, it waited, patient and steady, until it was undeniable. When my attorney stood, her presence filled the room not with noise, but with clarity. She presented text messages, each one dripping with Brian's contempt. She played voicemails where his threats cracked through the air like whips. Neighbors had given sworn statements, and those words painted the reality of what Emily and I had endured. Piece by piece, his mask of respectability was dismantled. I glanced at Emily as she shifted uncomfortably, her eyes glassy with regret. Then came the moment I never expected. The judge paused, removing his glasses and leaning forward. He studied me carefully, his brow furrowing as though he were chasing a memory buried under years of time. Then, softly, he said he remembered me from decades earlier, when he was just a timid intern struggling in a family court office. I had stayed late one evening, helping him sort through piles of paperwork when no one else had the patience. He said he never forgot that small kindness, the way I had encouraged him with simple words that gave him confidence. Hearing this, my throat tightened. I had no memory of it. It was just one of countless evenings where I had done what needed to be done, but to him, it had mattered. To him, it had shaped something. And now, all these years later, it circled back in the most unexpected place. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge's voice grew firmer. He said the evidence was clear. The manipulation hadn't come from me. It had come from Brian. He declared that I had been subjected to intimidation and coercion, while Brian had twisted the truth to serve only himself. Then, with a firm strike of the gavel, he ruled in my favor. Brian was barred from approaching me or Emily, stripped of rights until further review, and ordered to pay damages for the suffering he had caused. Relief washed over me like a wave breaking against the shore. Emily wept quietly beside me, her hand trembling as it reached for mine. For the first time in months, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. Justice had not only been served, it had been seen. Walking out of that courtroom, I knew the scars would remain, but something new had taken root. This was not just survival, it was the beginning of rebuilding. The fight was over, and the next chapter, healing and legacy, was waiting to be written. When the courtroom battle ended, Emily came back home. At first, it felt fragile, like walking on thin ice. We spoke carefully, our words clipped and practical. But over time, her actions began to speak louder than her apologies ever could. She washed her dishes right after meals, kept her room tidy, and even tended to David's violets without being asked. One afternoon, I found her quietly folding laundry in the living room, her hands shaking as if afraid I might dismiss the gesture. In that moment, I realized healing had already begun, not through grand declarations, but through small, steady acts of care. I also knew my journey couldn't stop with just repairing what was broken at home. David's hidden legacy was too powerful, too purposeful, to keep only for myself. With guidance from trusted friends, I started the Second Porch Foundation. The name came from a simple idea: every woman deserves another place to sit, to breathe, to belong, when her first porch has been taken from her. In the first year alone, we sheltered 15 women. Their stories echoed my own mother's, whose children had abandoned them. Wives discarded by husbands once they grew frail. Sisters cheated out of their rightful homes. I remember one letter that still sits in my desk drawer. It said, "You gave me back my name. I am not just a burden anymore." Those words reminded me that my pain had not been wasted. It had been transformed into purpose. Years passed, and peace returned to our home. By the time Emily's daughter was 4, laughter filled the garden once more. I would watch little Isla chase butterflies barefoot across the grass while Emily stood nearby, her hands dusted with flour from Sunday baking, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since her childhood. The foundation grew too, and one spring afternoon I received an invitation to the dedication of our third home. Later that week, a retired judge visited with his wife to thank me for the work we had done. As he shook my hand, I thought of David and how he had planned all this in silence, trusting that one day I would know what to do with it. Looking back now, I understand that true strength was never about shouting louder or fighting harder. It was in standing calmly with the truth in my hands, refusing to be erased. David's letter had told me to use power not to hurt, but to teach. That became the foundation of everything I built, from reconciling with Emily to helping women I may never meet again. If my story resonates with you, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more. Together, we can remind the world that dignity never expires, and kindness always finds its way back.